There is a peculiar kind of pain that doesn't come from enemies. It doesn't stem from strangers who wish you harm. No, it's the pain born of loyalty given to the wrong people. It's the agony of realizing that the ones you defended never once defended you. That those you bled for would have let you die with a smile on their face just because it was easier than standing beside you when things got hard. You see, betrayal is not a thunderclap, it's a slow, suffocating silence. It's the look on their faces when your world collapses and none of them reach out. It's the echo of your own screams in a room filled with people who promised they'd never leave. And still they did. They let you burn. They watched the fire consume you. They looked away and went on with their lives as if your sacrifice was nothing more than background noise. Why? Why do people do this? Why do they take the most tender hearts and rip them to shreds under the guise of misunderstanding or circumstance? Because they can. Because you let them. Because your compassion was their convenience. Your love was their leverage. And when the moment came to return even a fragment of what you gave, they vanish. Like cowards dressed as companions, like shadows that fade when the light goes out. But here's the truth no one tells you. Suffering teaches you who you are. And suffering caused by betrayal? That's the deepest mirror of all. It exposes your blind loyalty, your naivety, your self-sacrifice, but more importantly, it exposes them. It unmasks the people who used your kindness as a stepping stone. It reveals the parasites who fed off your strength while praying for your silence. So, let's be honest, brutally honest. You begged for their love and they gave you indifference. You stood between them and the chaos and they walked past your broken body like it never mattered. You endured humiliation, carried burdens not meant for you, and protected people who, in the end, couldn't even protect your name. And still you stayed. You stayed hoping they'd change, hoping they'd see you, hoping they'd at least say thank you. But they didn't, because people like that don't reflect until the mirror breaks. They don't cry until they lose the one person who would have died for them. But now, something's different. Now you're waking up. And the blood you spilled is no longer a testament to your weakness, it's a witness to your strength. You survived what was meant to destroy you. And now it's their turn, not for revenge, but for regret. Let them bleed, not from your hands, but from the weight of their own conscience. Let them remember every time they left you unheard. Let them taste the silence they once served you. Not because you wish them harm, but because life has a way of balancing the scales. You were never weak for giving too much, but they were always weak for taking and never returning. So ask yourself, how many more years will you spend explaining your worth to people who see you as disposable? How many more tears will you shed over those who never deserved your love in the first place? And when will you decide that your healing no longer requires their apology? The time has come not for vengeance, but for liberation. Let the truth speak where your words no longer need to. Let your silence scream louder than the loyalty they betrayed. It begins with something deceptively beautiful. Hope. Hope that your loyalty will be enough. Hope that if you give without limit, love without condition, and stand by them no matter what, they will one day recognize your worth and return the favor. But what if that hope is a lie? What if the loyalty you offer is not a reflection of your strength, but a mirror of your own unhealed need to be seen, needed, or loved? We're taught that loyalty is a virtue, and it is. But unexamined loyalty, blind, desperate, self-sacrificing loyalty, can be the rope you unknowingly hand to those who will hang your soul with it. When you give and give, even when it costs you your peace, your dignity, your sense of self, what are you truly offering? Is it love or is it submission disguised as devotion? People don't just hurt you, you invite them in. And the most dangerous ones are not the obvious villains. They're the ones who smile while draining your spirit. They don't scream, they whisper. They don't slap, they ignore. And yet, your loyalty keeps you there. Hoping, wishing, waiting, believing that if you just give them a little more of yourself, maybe then they'll finally understand. But they don't, because for them, your loyalty isn't love, it's convenience. It's the assurance that no matter how they treat you, you won't leave. That no matter how many times they fail you, you'll still show up. You've been conditioned to bleed at the altar of false loyalty, and in doing so, you've built temples for people who would never build a shelter for you. Ask yourself, how many times have you justified their neglect by calling it just a bad day? How many nights did you spend in emotional agony, still defending them to yourself, saying, they're not really like this? How often did you convince yourself that your suffering was noble, that staying quiet made you strong, that your patience was love? That's the illusion, that's the trap. True loyalty cannot exist without mutual respect, without reciprocity, without recognition of your humanity. And if your presence is only valued when you're useful, if your silence is expected when you're hurting, then what you're practicing isn't loyalty. It's self-erasure. It's spiritual suicide under the banner of nobility. There's something terrifying in realizing you've given your soul to people who only loved your availability, people who mistook your kindness for weakness and your loyalty for permission to keep wounding you. But what's even more terrifying is how long you'll stay once you know the truth. Why? Because admitting you were wrong about someone requires more courage than loving them ever did. And yet, there's a quiet kind of bravery in waking up, in seeing clearly, in acknowledging that your loyalty wasn't a gift, it was a bleeding wound, and they were never trying to stop the bleeding, they were just stepping around it, making sure it didn't stain their shoes. It hurts. God, it hurts. Because you weren't stupid, you were sincere, you weren't weak, you were hopeful. And that's the cruel paradox. The deeper your love, the more it's used against you in the hands of the wrong person. But pain has a way of opening your eyes. And once the illusion fades, what's left is raw truth. You've bled for people who never brought you a bandage. You defended people who weaponized your silence. And you stayed, thinking that love meant enduring pain. It doesn't. Loyalty is only virtuous when it's mutual. Otherwise, it's bondage. And the people who let you bleed, without care, without pause, without shame, they were never your people. They were simply passing through, collecting what they could and leaving once your soul no longer served their comfort. So the real question becomes, how much more of yourself are you willing to lose just to keep people who wouldn't notice if you disappeared? There's a precise moment, a single devastating instance when you realize they're no longer there. Not physically, perhaps. They may still occupy the same room, still speak the same words. But something is missing. The presence is hollow, the bond ruptured, and suddenly you're no longer seen, you're tolerated. You become background noise in a life you once held together with your bare hands. What follows is not rage. It's not even immediate heartbreak. It's silence. An aching, suffocating silence that swallows you whole. It's in the way your messages go unanswered just long enough to make you feel like a burden. It's in the subtle withdrawal of affection, the way their eyes avoid yours, the sudden lack of urgency in their voice when they speak your name. That silence? That's what breaks you. Because it isn't just absence, it's abandonment with a smile. They didn't need to scream or slam doors, they simply stopped choosing you, quietly, consistently, and you felt it in the very bones of your being. You knew they were letting go, but you still held on. Why? Because you couldn't believe that someone you sacrificed so much for would treat you like a temporary placeholder. You convinced yourself it was just a phase, that maybe they were tired or distracted or stressed. But deep down you felt it. The emotional exile, the coldness that crept in where warmth used to live. You became a stranger to the person whose battles you once fought, the very same person who now looks at you like a ghost of a memory they'd rather forget. And what makes it worse? You still showed up. You still checked in. Still prayed for them, still stood in their corner, even as they slowly erased you from theirs. Because you weren't ready to admit what had already happened. You weren't ready to accept that they had let go of a connection you were still fighting to save. So you internalized it. You began to question your own worth. You retraced every step, every conversation, looking for the misstep that caused their withdrawal. Was it something you said, something you didn't say? Did you ask for too much? Were you too emotional, too available? But here's the bitter truth. They let go because it was easy, because they had the luxury of knowing that your love was unwavering, even if their presence was not. They took comfort in your consistency while offering you only fragments of theirs. And that imbalance, that's what left you drowning in silence. People often underestimate the violence of emotional neglect, but it is a quiet war, a soul-level starvation. You can survive without a lot of things, but the absence of being valued by those you value most, that is a brutal kind of death, one that kills you slowly, one that doesn't leave bruises but scars the spirit. And yet, through that silence, something else emerges, a different kind of voice. Yours, the one that has been silenced for far too long, the one that kept excusing their behavior, rationalizing their absence, minimizing your needs. And as the silence from them grows louder, so too does your own inner truth. You begin to hear yourself again. You begin to realize that you didn't deserve the distance. You didn't deserve to be made to feel replaceable. And maybe, just maybe, their silence was never about you. It was a reflection of their own emotional cowardice. They couldn't confront your value because it made them uncomfortable, because it demanded depth they weren't ready to give. So they chose distance, not with honesty, not with integrity, but with passivity. So now here you are, alone, yes, but awakened. And the moment they let go, it becomes the moment you begin to rise. Because if someone can watch you bleed and remain silent, they were never meant to hold your heart in the first place. There comes a point, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, when the veil lifts and you begin to see it. Not just the person, but the pattern, the cycle, the manipulation dressed as affection, the way they praised you just enough to keep you close, but never truly saw you. The way they gave you crumbs and called it a feast, and you accepted it starving because you didn't want to believe the truth. But the truth, no matter how long it hides, always demands to be seen. It begins with discomfort, a gnawing feeling that something is off. You can't explain it at first. You just feel tired, drained, confused. You start to realize that love in its truest form shouldn't make you question your worth. It shouldn't feel like a test you're always failing. And yet, with them, you were constantly on trial, walking on eggshells, trying to be enough, trying to avoid triggering their silence, their coldness, their disdain. That's not love, that's control. When someone begins to weaponize your emotions against you, using your kindness as a leash, your patience as a cage. That's not affection. That's psychological warfare, and what makes it so sinister is its subtlety. They don't need to scream or insult you. All they need to do is withdraw when you need them most. Offer conditional love. Punish you with distance every time you speak your truth. And you, in your innocence, thought it was your fault. You thought if you loved harder, gave more, forgave faster, they would return to the person they pretended to be at the beginning. But that person never existed. They were simply mirroring your own goodness to gain your trust. And once they had it, they distorted it. They used it to make you question your instincts, to make you doubt your sanity. You were told you were too sensitive, that you overreact, that nothing ever pleases you, and so you silenced yourself, bit your tongue, suppressed your feelings. You began editing yourself just to be digestible to someone who never intended to nourish you in the first place. And here's the tragedy. This doesn't happen to you because you're weak. It happens because you're strong in the wrong direction. Your empathy becomes their tool. Your loyalty becomes their insurance policy. Your hope becomes the trap. But once you wake up, truly wake up, something shifts. You begin to see that the love you gave wasn't the problem. The problem was who you gave it to. People who manipulate don't look for selfish people. They look for givers. They look for those who were taught to earn love by sacrificing themselves. They look for the ones who feel guilty for setting boundaries, who confuse abandonment with their own unworthiness. So when love becomes a weapon, you bleed and call it destiny. You suffer and call it growth. You stay and call it strength. But no more. There is a painful liberation in waking up. It rips away the comfort of illusion and replaces it with the clarity of pain. And in that pain, you finally start to reclaim your voice. You begin to say things you were once afraid to say. You begin to feel things you were told were wrong to feel. You begin to ask questions you were once too broken to ask. Why am I the only one bending? Why does love feel like punishment? Why am I afraid to speak around someone who claims to care? These questions are the beginning of your rebirth, because real love does not demand your silence. It does not require your suffering as proof of devotion. Real love heals. It sees. It holds. And when you realize that what you called love was actually fear disguised as loyalty, you finally step into your power. You stop asking to be seen. You start choosing to walk away. Pain is not just a punishment. It is not merely something to be endured until it passes. No, pain is information. It is instruction. It tells you where you've been wounded, where you've been blind, and where you've handed over your power too freely. It does not lie. Pain is perhaps the most honest voice in your life because it has no agenda but truth. And when betrayal is the cause of that pain, the wound is not physical, it is existential. It strikes at the core of your identity. You begin to question not just your relationship with others, but your relationship with yourself. How could you not see it? How could you let it go on for so long? Why did you allow yourself to become so small just to fit into someone else's life? These questions don't come from weakness. They come from awakening, from the first trembling steps out of denial and into clarity. Pain forces you to confront not only what was done to you, but what you allowed in the name of love, loyalty, and hope. And that confrontation, it changes you, because once you've sat alone with your suffering, truly alone, you discover something terrifying and liberating. No one is coming to save you. The apology might never come. The recognition might never be given. And still, you must rise. Still, you must carry what was shattered inside you and build something new with it. There's a strength born in that silence, a depth forged in that darkness. And it's not the kind of strength that looks heroic. It's quiet, it's patient. It's the kind of strength that allows you to stand in the same room as the people who broke you and feel nothing. Not hatred, not longing, just distance, just truth, just peace. That is what pain teaches you when you stop running from it. You begin to realize that your suffering was not in vain. It stripped away your illusions. It removed your need for validation from those who never deserved to hold your heart. It taught you the language of boundaries. It gave you the voice you were once afraid to use. And let's be honest, without the pain, you wouldn't have changed. You would have stayed in that loop, begging for scraps, mistaking attention for love and chaos for passion. You would have kept bleeding, calling it sacrifice, because the fear of being alone felt worse than the cost of being mistreated. But now you know better. You see yourself differently, not as the broken one, but as the one who survived, the one who endured what others would have collapsed under, the one who carried wounds not visible to the world, but deep enough to reshape the soul. And instead of becoming bitter, you became discerning. Instead of shutting down, you learned to choose wisely. You learned that not everyone deserves access to your vulnerability, and that love, when it's real, never requires you to suffer endlessly to prove it. There's a kind of quiet power that comes from having been burned and still choosing to love yourself. From having been shattered and still choosing to rebuild brick by brick without asking anyone for permission. That power cannot be faked. It cannot be stolen, and it cannot be taken by the same people who once wounded you. Because now the parts of you that bled are the very parts that carry wisdom. You no longer chase. You no longer beg. You no longer tolerate. You stand. because the pain that broke you became the fire that forged you. There is an immutable law woven into the fabric of reality, a law older than any institution, deeper than any philosophy. What you sow, you reap. You may not see it immediately. Justice doesn't always arrive with thunder and lightning. Often it comes quietly, slowly, relentlessly, like a shadow stretching across the floor as the sun begins to set. Karma is not revenge. It's not driven by your anger or your grief. It doesn't need you to lift a finger. It simply waits for people to face the weight of what they've done, and for the illusions they live behind to finally shatter under the pressure of truth. And make no mistake, they will feel it. The ones who let you bleed while they watched in silence, the ones who fed off your love but couldn't offer it in return, they are not escaping unscathed. No one does. You may think they've moved on, that they're living happily while you sit alone picking up the pieces they shattered, but that's an illusion, a temporary mask, because the universe has a way of turning mirrors toward those who refuse to see. There will come a day, unexpected, unplanned, when they sit alone with the echo of your name, when they scroll through old conversations, trying to remember when they stopped caring, when they look into the eyes of people they've surrounded themselves with and realize none of them would bleed for them the way you did. None of them would have stayed through the storm. None of them carry that rare kind of soul that gives without demand. And that's when the regret begins. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep, aching, gnawing, paralyzing, because the loss of something real doesn't always feel immediate. It creeps in slowly. It settles in the quiet moments. It whispers in the spaces where your presence used to be. You were a constant, a protector, a healer, and they dismissed you like an afterthought. Now they'll remember. Not because you forced them to, not because you wanted them to suffer, but because karma doesn't need your anger. It thrives on balance, and eventually everyone is forced to sit in the truth of what they've done. What they didn't understand, what they still might not, is that you were the one thing in their life that didn't come with conditions. You were the one who showed up without needing applause, who stayed without demanding loyalty, who gave everything without keeping score. And in their arrogance, they mistook that for weakness. But now, that silence they once weaponized against you has returned to them. That cold distance they used as punishment has become their own prison. And the person they now miss isn't the version of you they pushed away. It's the version of themselves that only existed because you were there to believe in them. That's what karma takes. It doesn't always strike with punishment. It reveals. It makes people see who they really are without the one who made them feel whole. So you don't need to seek vengeance. You don't need to prove your worth. Life will handle it. Let them carry the weight of their choices. Let them wake up each day with the realization that they lost something they will never again find in another. And when that day comes, when karma comes knocking, they won't remember the details of the argument. They won't remember what you said last. They'll remember how you made them feel. They'll remember your loyalty, your compassion, your strength, your fire, all the things they took for granted. And they'll bleed, not by your hand, but by the emptiness they created with their own. There is a moment when the dust of betrayal has settled and the wounds have started to scar, where you're presented with a choice. Will you scream your pain into the world, or will you allow your silence to speak for you? The temptation to retaliate is real. It's a primal instinct. It's a reaction to injustice, hardwired into our nervous systems. You want them to feel what you felt. You want them to know the ache they left in your chest, the void they carved in your soul. You imagine the confrontation, your words piercing through their indifference, your anger dismantling their arrogance. You fantasize about the moment they finally understand, finally hurt, finally regret. But vengeance, true vengeance, is not in the outburst. It's not in public displays or explosive retaliation. That kind of release may satisfy the ego, but it starves the spirit. It leaves you tangled in the very energy that broke you. Because when you retaliate with fury, you become chained to the person who hurt you. Your healing becomes dependent on their reaction. Your freedom becomes tied to their suffering. And that in itself is another form of imprisonment. So what if you chose silence instead? Not the kind of silence that shrinks or hides, but the kind that asserts, the kind that reclaims, the kind that no longer needs validation or revenge to feel whole. That silence, the sacred, grounded, dignified silence, is not weakness. It is power. It is the declaration that you no longer need the battlefield, that you have nothing left to prove. When you go silent, you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop pleading your case to judges who were never listening. You stop offering pieces of your soul as evidence for your worth, and instead, you step back, you watch, you allow the consequences of their actions to unfold without interference. It is an excruciating form of strength, because everything in you wants to speak. You want to scream, "Look what you did to me." You want to expose the lies, the betrayal, the manipulation. But true transformation happens not when you force others to see your value, but when you finally recognize that their inability to see it is not your failure, it is their limitation. And limitations, once revealed, are irreversible. You must understand this. Silence is not the absence of voice. It is the presence of restraint. It's the conscious decision to rise above the noise, to create a distance that no argument can cross. Because when you stop responding, they are left alone with themselves. And that is where the real punishment begins. People often forget that the loudest thing in the world is the echo of a conscience. And when someone has wronged you, truly wronged you, your silence becomes that echo. It grows in their mind like a vine, wrapping itself around memories they tried to bury. It waits at the edges of their comfort, whispering reminders in moments of stillness. It questions them in the quiet of night, long after the damage has been done. You don't need to deliver karma. You don't need to script their awakening. Life is far more intricate than that. People eventually encounter themselves. And when they do, they remember those they harmed most, not the ones who screamed, but the ones who walked away with nothing but their dignity. And that silence, your silence, is where regret festers, because it cannot be argued with, it cannot be dismissed. It doesn't give them a reason to defend themselves or spin another version of the truth. It just is. A mirror they cannot turn away from. Let them wonder why you stopped reaching out. Let them feel the absence of your voice, the same one they ignored for so long. Let them sit in the vacuum they created when they chose to disregard your pain. And you move forward, quietly, steadily, not because you're indifferent, but because you've made peace with the truth. They are not capable of giving you what you gave them. And that is not your fault. That is simply a reality that must be accepted, not argued with. So you stay silent. And in that silence, you build, you heal, you grow, you stop telling your story to people who only listen to the parts that suited them, and you begin telling it to yourself, not as a tale of suffering, but as a testimony of survival. You don't rise by proving people wrong, you rise by outgrowing the need to. There comes a day when you no longer recognize the version of yourself you've become, not because you've grown, but because you've shrunk. You look in the mirror and you don't see strength, you see fatigue. You don't see clarity, you see someone who has spent so much time trying to be enough for people who never even tried to understand you. And it's in that quiet, almost unbearable moment of self-awareness that the truth hits you. You've been bleeding for people who were never interested in healing you. You gave them your emotional currency day after day until your soul was in deficit. And for what? For a half-hearted response? For conditional affection? For temporary companionship built on the shaky foundation of your constant effort? You thought love meant giving until it hurt, but it doesn't. Love without mutual care is not noble. It is destructive. You kept pouring from your own well, hoping they'd notice you were running dry. But people who are comfortable drinking from you without ever asking how you're doing, they are not partners. They are takers. And if you're not careful, you become their source of energy while they become the architects of your slow, silent collapse. What makes this especially tragic is that you didn't do it blindly. No, on some level, you knew you weren't being treated right, but you made excuses. You told yourself they were going through something, that you needed to be more understanding, that it's just a phase. You told yourself these lies because the truth, that they simply didn't value you the way you valued them, was too painful to accept. But there's a cost to carrying others who refuse to walk. There's a cost to bleeding for people who recoil at the sight of your wounds. You begin to lose touch with who you are. You start adapting your behavior just to maintain peace. You suppress your instincts. You second-guess your boundaries. And before long, you forget what it even felt like to exist freely, without apology, without begging, without adjusting every aspect of your identity just to be tolerable to someone else's dysfunction. And that's the moment where reclamation begins. Not with anger, not with a grand declaration, but with a decision. A subtle, powerful decision to return to yourself, to start showing up for the person you neglected most in the process, you. You realize that you cannot wait for someone else to hand you back your worth, that you must rise and take it yourself. You cannot beg others to give you what they've proven they will not. And you no longer try to earn love through sacrifice, because real love does not need to be earned with suffering. It meets you where you are. It doesn't punish you for having needs. It doesn't turn cold when you speak your truth. You begin to see that healing doesn't come from more giving. It comes from stopping the bleeding, from stepping back and saying no more. No more being the emotional bandage for people who rip you open. No more making excuses for those who cannot show up. No more offering your loyalty to people who treat it as an entitlement instead of a gift. You reclaim your energy. You reestablish your boundaries. You'll remember the dreams you let slip away while focusing on keeping others whole. You rediscover the voice you quieted, the passion you buried, the light they said was too much. And the irony? The moment you reclaim yourself is the moment they start to notice. Suddenly, they feel your absence. They sense the shift. The energy they used to feed on is no longer available. And they may come back. They may knock again, not because they've changed, but because they miss the version of you who kept bleeding to make them feel whole. But that version of you is gone. You buried them in silence, and in their place stands someone who has remembered who they are. You don't seek revenge. You don't demand apologies. You simply stop participating in your own depletion. You understand now that not everyone deserves access to your sacred, soft, powerful heart. That love without reciprocity is not love, it's exploitation, and your healing is not dependent on their remorse. It begins the moment you stop handing out pieces of yourself like they're disposable. So now you walk not away from them, but back to yourself, back to the place where your worth is no longer a question, where your energy is sacred, where your love is a treasure, not a test. So here you are now, not broken, not bitter, but awakened. You've walked through the fire of betrayal and didn't turn to ash. You stood in the silence of abandonment and learned to hear your own voice again. You loved with intensity, gave without limits, and in return you were met with indifference, manipulation, and neglect. But that doesn't define you, that reveals them. You were not weak for giving. You were not foolish for staying. You were human. Beautifully, deeply human, in a world that often punishes sincerity. But you survived. And not only did you survive, you grew. You learned, you transformed. They let you bleed, thinking you would never stop. They believed their absence would break you, that your silence would be surrender. But your silence became your strength. Your walking away became your revolution. Your healing, done quietly, without announcement, became your loudest response. And now, they will remember you not as the one who begged, but as the one who rose, as the one who gave everything, and when it wasn't enough, didn't crumble, but evolved. They'll sit in the wake of your absence and feel the weight of your presence like a ghost that never quite leaves. That's not vengeance. That's consequence. Let them bleed, not by your hand, but by the mirror they now must face. Let them carry the memory of what they destroyed. Let them regret losing the rarest thing they'll ever encounter, a soul who loved them without condition. You gave them the chance to grow, to rise with you. They chose to remain small. Now you walk alone, not in loneliness, but in strength, clarity, and purpose. Because the real victory, it's not in watching them suffer. It's in watching yourself heal. And as you close the chapter on those who couldn't love you the way you deserved, remember this. You are not here to bleed for people who don't even know how to hold a bandage. You are not here to teach someone your value. You are here to embody it. So walk forward, not for revenge, but because you no longer belong in places that require you to die quietly just to be accepted. You belong in the light you were always afraid to claim, and now you're finally ready to step into it.